Hi, I'm Jennifer, and this is Ask a Humanist for January 2013. I hope everybody had a great New Year and great holiday season. This Ask a Humanist is actually going to be focused on some questions that were presented to me from a man named D.T. Strain, who runs the Spiritual Naturalist Society. And just, full disclosure, I'm on his board for the Spiritual Naturalist Society. So these questions are kind of in line with the sorts of questions that the people there tend to ask and the information they want to know about humanism. Humanism is a natural philosophy, meaning it rejects supernaturalism. So it is focused on how to be a better person and how to live your life more fully and effectively. And so in that sense, it's kind of like, it's almost like a spiritual practice, although most humanists don't use that word. And when we do use the word spiritual, we're talking about spiritual in a secular sense, meaning that it doesn't have any supernatural connotations. It's not about our soul. It's about what kind of spirit with which we live our lives. The motivation we have for living lives, which is very different from kind of the rational side of the philosophy, which does in fact reject supernaturalism and has all sorts of reasons why we reject supernaturalism. But at the end of the day, it is a naturalist philosophy, so it does reject supernaturalism. Real quickly on why that's so. Supernaturalism is really bad when it comes to solving problems. It's just not a very effective way to solve problems. So a humanist rejects supernaturalism not to be a jerk, but because we want to solve our problems. And, here's the example. If you have a field that needs water on it, you could pray for rain, which is kind of a supernatural solution to the problem, or you could roll up your sleeves, dig a ditch, and irrigate the field. And the humanist solution is going to be to irrigate the field. And the reason for that is not that we're saying that there's no such thing as supernaturalism, but it's just not reliable. If I irrigate my field, I will definitely get water on my field. If I pray for rain, I might get water on my field. So right off the bat, the natural solution is the more effective solution. And this carries through like with all problem solving. So there is no incident so far shown to any humanist that the supernatural solution was the better solution or the more reliable solution. It's just that the natural solutions are better. That's why we favor the natural solutions. And, that's the big reason why we're a secular philosophy and a natural philosophy. So let's get to the first question. He wants to know, what do humanists seek out for guidance when they need to work on things they don't like about themselves? Such as their bad tempers or impatience or not being compassionate. And how does a humanist go about fixing the bad habits that we have? And I think the answer is in the key that I just called them habits. Humans, there's a real big debate about free will, like how much free will we as humans have. There's a certain amount of instinctual behavior that's built into us, like the fight response. But there's also a question about whether or not what I'm saying out of my mouth right now is even something I'm thinking about or whether it was predetermined. And eliminating supernaturalism does not eliminate the free will debate. There's a huge debate in science about whether or not we have free will. Now, what seems to be clear is that while we don't exactly have free will, we kind of sort of do at the same time. And the kind of sort of do part is that we have kind of a feedback mechanism, meaning that we can learn and we can adjust our learning and therefore our behaviors going forward. But habit is really strong. And even with the most intellectual person, if they have a habit, they're going to have a hard time breaking it. Let me give you an example of this. There was one time I dropped my son off at school, and I have a route I drive home from school. And we had talked about going to a store for something, and I really needed to go by the store, but I literally was unable to make the right turns to go to that store. I literally had to go home first because the habit kept me going home before I could go off on a new trip. And it was kind of embarrassing. I'm like, what's going on? Well, that's the power of habit. So if we have a bad behavior that we're doing, maybe we lose our temper, maybe we're impatient, maybe we're not as compassionate with people in the supermarket that can't work the swipey thing as we would like. How do we fix that aspect of ourselves that we want to change? And the reason so many people fail at this, and the reason why there's such a huge market for self-help, is because it's not easy to change these things. These are habits. In order to get rid of an old habit, you kind of have to replace it with a new habit. Now, the good thing is that, once again, science comes to the rescue. And we actually know quite a bit about how habits are formed and how to extinguish bad habits and how to establish new habits. So if you're using, say, any online like weight loss program or an app, there's an app for that. What these apps do is they reward you for the new behavior you want, and they don't reward you for the behavior you don't want. It's not that you're not getting punished if you eat too much by your app. It just tells you ate too much, and that's it. But you do, if you exercise, you get points for which you can eat more. So you're rewarded for the good habits and not rewarded for bad habits. And this is what behavioral management is known as the extinguishing process. You're extinguishing a habit you don't want and replacing it with a habit you do. And this is how the humanist goes about changing our behavior. We start practicing the behavior we want. We remind ourselves. We know we're extinguishing a habit, and that takes time. So we're compassionate with ourselves as much as we can be when we're annoying ourselves. And, you know, we reward ourselves when we do the right thing. And we are compassionate with ourselves and go, oh, well, I'll try better next time for the thing that we don't want to do. And over time, we find that we can replace our bad habits with better habits. And this is exactly how people stop smoking effectively. This is how they lose weight. I've lost like over 25 pounds in the last year from doing this. So it's perfectly easy to do this. You don't need anything supernatural to help you change your behaviors. You just have to be committed to the process, and you have to understand what that process is, which is that you need to establish new behaviors and get rid of the old bad habits. And there's a way you do that. And it's actually fairly simple. And it's a fairly simple process, but it takes time. And this is, I think, what frustrates people. They say, I want to change, and they want the change now, and they're not willing to do the hard work of establishing a new pattern of behavior, which can take 30 to 40 days of every day working on that new behavior before that new behavior becomes a habit. Now, one of the areas I get asked about a lot is how to be more compassionate in the moment. How to, when someone annoys us, how do we change our annoyance into compassion? I think everybody struggles with this to a certain extent, because we all know that we behave better and we're nicer people and we feel better about ourselves when we don't take other people's bait and we don't allow them to get us upset. But that's really hard to do, especially with relatives, because they know what buttons to push. And that just takes time. It takes practice. And what I tell all my clients is no one does this perfectly. You know, if you're expecting perfection from yourself, you're going to fail, because that's not how establishing a new habit and getting rid of an old habit happens. You have to be okay with the fact that you're not going to do this perfectly, but that you're going to try anyway, so that you keep trying until the new habit is established. So generally speaking, what happens is if someone annoys me, I get annoyed, I get frustrated, I get hurt. And that's my first emotional response. But what I practice doing is, when I can think a little bit more clearly, I think, wait, this is not the emotion I want to feel. I should feel compassion. And then that changes my attitude about myself and about the person who's annoying me. And my feeling on it is, you know, I'm never going to have my first response to annoying situations be compassion. I don't think that's a realistic goal. My first response is going to be annoyance, fear, anger, you know, the negative emotions. But my practice isn't about replacing those negative emotions. It's how quickly can I make the switch from that annoyance to the compassion. How quickly can I make that switch? And now I can make it within a minute or so. But that took practice. It took months and months and years of practice and consciously working on it, because my instinctual response, because of what's happened, is the fear, the anger, and things like that. So it's just about establishing a new pattern of behavior and a new habit. So if you're trying to extinguish a bad habit and learn a new one, and you're having trouble doing it on your own, there are other resources that you can get help with. I recommend to people all the time that if there's something that they're really struggling with and they're not able to take care of it themselves, that they really should contact a psychologist. And there's an association for humanistic psychology, and these people are trained in humanistic techniques and behavioral management, and they will help you as you work through the old bad habits and learn the new ones. And I've taken advantage of psychologists myself, and they really, really help. I had a problem with a stalker for a while, and the fear it wasn't fear, it was terror, to be perfectly honest. And I went to a psychologist who helped me interrupt the bad habits I was in, the instinctual responses I had that I didn't like, and replace them with more positive ways of responding to the stimulus of being stalked. So breathing exercises to interrupt a panic attack, for instance, and they really help. So if you are struggling with something, you're not able to fix it on your own, I do recommend seeking the help of a professional psychologist. There are things that we all need help with, and I think there's a stigma attached to seeking that help, but we get over that and just seek the help. They can help you with weight loss, they can help you with smoking, they can help you with whatever bad habit you want to get rid of, and they'll really, really help, as opposed to all the self-help stuff, which is snake oil, to be perfectly honest. Woo-based snake oil. And a humanist does not go into woo-based snake oil. We go for what really works, and what really works is either working on the habit yourself or having someone help you reestablish new habits and get rid of the old ones. That's what works, and that's what a humanist does. Okay, so the second question is, how does a humanist deal with extreme tragedy? Not necessarily the prevention of it, but dealing with it once it's already happened. And obviously, we've had in December, the Sandy Hook killings, where 20 kids were shot. Their faces were blown off by a guy with a big gun. So how does a humanist cope with the emotions that come with tragedy? And the answer is pretty much like everybody else, although the grieving process for a humanist is slightly different. And part of the emotions that occur in the wake of a tragedy is grief. And grief is probably the hardest emotion for humans to experience. It's physically traumatic. It's not just an emotion. It affects your whole body. And most people would rather feel anger than feel grief. And, they act out on that anger rather than confront their own grief. So it really is a problem. Now, the humanist approach is kind of twofold. One is that we take a humanist approach to the grief that we're experiencing because of the tragedy. And our goal is to just experience the grief as quickly as possible. We don't like experience it. No one does. But we're not going to hide from our grief either or try to not feel it. We're just going to feel it and get it out of the way. It's kind of like ripping off a Band-Aid, right? The sooner you get through the grief, the happier you're going to be. And this is not to deny the sorrow that comes with grief or to demean or diminish the tragedy that occurred that is causing the grief. It's more that this is just a natural process that occurs, and the less we get in the way of our own emotional healing, the better. And the way you get out of the way is just allow yourself to experience those emotions. Now, the other side of that is the preventative side. That we can't prevent a tragedy that's already occurred, but maybe we could prevent future tragedies. And I think, especially with Sandy Hook, that obviously we now have a debate about gun control, and it's a long time coming. That, I personally am sick of every day reading a headline where someone shot in America or a group of people were shot in America. I'm really sick of reading these headlines because every single person who died is a real person with a real family. So the question is, well, what do we do about that aspect of responding to a tragedy? Yes, we have our own grief. The problem with grief is that anger and frustration and helplessness are kind of in the mix of the grief experience. And as humanists, we know that in order to solve our problems, we have to be as rational as possible. And so we need compassion to help us out of the grief and into problem-solving mode. And because we don't want to just lash out and create a solution that's going to make things worse. We want a solution to the problem, if at all, that will actually solve the problem. And this is, I think, where, you know, the serenity prayer, the serenity prayer comes into play. And the serenity prayer is, God, help me to have the courage to change the things I need to change, and the patience to abide the things that I cannot change, and the wisdom to know the difference. And we can't know, the key to this is knowing the difference. So how do we know whether there's something we can change or whether this is something we can't prevent? Like, you know, a tsunami. You can't prevent a tsunami. But maybe there is something you can do to give people an early warning. So the response to the tsunamis is to make sure that we have, you know, aid structures in place so that if a tsunami occurs, we can get aid to people. But the other part is, well, we can't prevent it because it's an act of nature, but maybe we can give people early warning, and that'll prevent the deaths. All right? So knowing what you can change and can't change is really critical to making sure you have a good response. And that, knowing the difference, is key. And this is why humanists are so adamant about a natural approach, a rational approach to problem solving, is because we know unless we're being rational, we are not going to have the wisdom to know the difference between what we can change and what we can impact and what we can't. Now, taking us back to Sandy Hook, you know, I think this approach can be really helpful in the gun debate. What do we do about guns? Do we ban them all? Do we not ban them all? High-clip magazines. This is where a humanist is going to fall back on the science. We want to know what works, what doesn't work, what can be impacted, what can't be impacted, so that we can come up with a solution that'll do the most good and the least amount of harm, and will not waste resources on things that won't work at all. So there's a lot of, like, when we go back to the tsunami thing, there's a lot of supernatural proposals for how to do tsunamis, and none of them work. And if we put our money into them, we'd be wasting money and resources that wouldn't help solve the problem. And the same thing is true of the gun debate. We really have to be informed about what the real information is, what really works, what really doesn't work, so that we can come up with a solution that does the most good and the least amount of harm. Now, I have friends that are gun owners and friends that aren't, and some of my gun owner friends are quite rational and other ones are a little less so. And, you know, looking at the information, like quoting the Australian studies, well, the Australian studies show that violent murder is down with gun control. And the problem we have in America is that we're not allowed to, because of the gun lobby, we're not allowed to collect statistics on the causes of gun deaths. We're not allowed to collect statistics that we need to make an informed decision, and it's really hampering us. So I think the role that humanists have, and that the humanist approach to tragedy, is actually quite helpful in terms of how we approach both the grief, but how we approach future prevention. Because we are so focused on solutions that are going to work and not just knee-jerk responses that aren't informed or based in reality. And this is not to say that every humanist out there knows what they're talking about. One of the reasons I'm giving generalities is because I'm not a gun control expert. I know I don't know enough to have a truly educated opinion. My suspicion is that some sort of gun regulation would be helpful and that it wouldn't infringe on our First Amendment rights to carry and own guns or to bear arms, naked arms, which I always think of when I hear right to bear arms. Anyways, I digress. So that is really what I think the humanist approach to tragedy really is to confront the grief, cope with the grief, deal with the grief, but not allow the emotions that come with grief to interfere with our problem solving as it comes to dealing with the aftermath of the tragedy and the need to see if there's anything we can do to prevent future tragedies. I think the final thing, with relationship to the Sandy Hook tragedy is that I think it would have been really nice had there been a concerted effort to help people grieve without supernaturalism? And I know a lot of people find comfort in supernaturalism when they're grieving, but it actually can get in the way of grief. So I think it would have been nice if the psychologists in the area had stepped up to offer free counseling, as opposed to leaving people at the hands of the churches. And I think there's a role for humanist communities there to, at the time of tragedies like this, is to step up with humanistic psychologists to assist people with the trauma and coping and whatnot. I think that would be really helpful. My 2 cents on that. So the third question, number 3, is what can a humanist do to build better relationships with those who don't share their views? Now again, this comes up because humanism lacks supernaturalism. We reject. It's not just that we lack supernaturalism, we reject supernaturalism. And this obviously upsets a lot of people. And for good reason. You know, I'm very popular on a variety of spirituality networks. They interview me. And there's a reason for that. There's a lot about humanism, which is very attractive to people who are looking to live their life more intentionally and more deliberately and more compassionately and more ethically. And that's really what humanism is. That's the approach to humanist life. A lot of what spirituality, this supernatural-based spirituality is, it's kind of an attempt to find humanism without the rejection of the supernaturalism. But the rejection of the supernaturalism is actually really important. You can't do away with it. And I get this all the time. It's like, well, why do you have to reject supernaturalism? And this is only ever said by people who have embraced supernaturalism. And my response is, if you want to embrace supernaturalism, you go right ahead, but don't tell me it's wrong of me to reject it. And humanism was specifically, the term was specifically coined to describe a non-religious, non-supernatural approach to living life ethically. And the reason it needed a name is because all the other approaches have supernaturalism in that. And there is this non-religious, non-supernatural approach to being a good person, and it needed its own name. It's not enough to say, I'm focused on being a good person, which is what my humanism is about. It really does need a name because people need a place to hang their hat. And, you know, the non-religious people are homeless. The non-religious people who care about ethics are homeless without the term humanism. Now, you know, I understand that a lot of with supernaturalism people also feel kind of homeless, and they're hoping that humanism will be it, and they're very disappointed when it's not because of the rejection of supernaturalism. But again, as I said at the beginning of this, there's a reason we reject supernaturalism, and that is because we actually want to solve our problems, and supernaturalism interferes with our ability to solve our problems. It's as simple as that. There is a cost and consequence to believing things that aren't true. Right? Now, if you're willing to take on that cost and consequence of believing things that don't have any proof because you just want to believe that this is the way things are, you go right ahead. I'm not going to stop you. I'm not going to tell you not to. All I'm going to say is, if it turns out that what you think is true is not true, you're going to waste time, resources, and energy solving problems you don't have instead of solving the very real problems that you do. Supernaturalism interferes with problem solving, period. It does. Because if you think that the reason your field doesn't have water is because a neighboring tribe put a curse on you, all your time and energy is going to be put into removing the curse instead of irrigating your field. This is not a question of just, oh, but I like to believe that power brand bracelets can help my balance. This is not a question of, you know, oh, it's harmless to read, you know, my astrology forecast, and it's fun. Why do you have to be such a wet rag? And the reason for that is because believing things that aren't true carries with it a cost. Now, sometimes that cost is really minor. Sometimes it's really huge. And I recommend everybody go to a website called What's the Harm? What's the harm in astrology? Well, people die because they believe in astrology, and, you know, they really do. All right? Some people take it to an extreme. So if you want to successfully solve your problems and not just pretend to solve your problems, You need to reject supernaturalism to do that. And I know I'm going to get a lot of flack from that, but I have yet to see any evidence that the supernatural approach benefited someone. There's a ton of evidence that it hurt them, no evidence that it helped them. The only thing a supernatural approach does is it helps people with their stress levels. It gives them, let's go back to the serenity prayer. You have to have the courage to change the things you need to change, the patience to bear the things that you can't change, and the wisdom to know the difference. It is really hard. Having the courage to change the things you need to change is hard. Having the patience to bear the things that you cannot change is even harder. And it causes a tremendous amount of stress on people. People are not happy when they don't have control over things. They don't want to admit that there's things beyond their control. So they invent ways that they might possibly have control. And this is a lot of what the supernatural-based beliefs are. It's a way for people to believe that they have control over things they don't have control over. But that's a fantasy. It's not real. And they end up spending time and energy focused on things, on trying to figure out ways to control things they can't control, instead of saying, I can't control that, what can I control? And the humanist approach is, I can't control that, what can I control, what can I make progress in? And as a result, you see humanists, and we're like happy, by and large. We're, by and large, fairly successful in life. Some of the most influential people in society have been humanists. So that's why we reject supernaturalism. So going back to DT's question about how do we build better relationships with people who don't share our views, who embrace supernaturalism, but like everything else about the humanist philosophy. And I think we have to be patient with them. There's a lot in the atheist movement that's, really, this is harmful, and this is harmful, you need to not do it. But that approach clearly doesn't work. It just shuts people down. And I think we can do a better job of being compassionate, respecting their right to believe things that don't have any evidence for. So it's a matter of faith as opposed to a matter of knowledge. And accept that that's kind of a common human thing to have happen. Well, just simply saying, well, I don't see things that way, I prefer a natural solution, and here's why. You can believe that if you want, but here's how I do it. And I've never run into problems with people by taking this approach, by respecting their right to believe differently, by respecting their right to believe things that, as long as I don't think they're very harmful. And I think that's really key for the non-religious, is to understand that there's a variety of beliefs out there. If I were to tell you that I believe that there's invisible flying pigs protecting my car when I drive, you'd probably think that was a bit odd. But you'd also probably think it's, on the whole, harmless. Unless I told you that as an act of faith I have to blindfold myself while driving. Suddenly my kind of quirky belief in invisible flying pigs that protect my car, not so harmless. It's kind of dangerous now. You'd be even more alarmed if I told you that I have, my invisible flying pigs tell me to kill people who don't believe in them and run them off the road. That would turn what is essentially a rather harmless belief and kind of quirky belief into a really, really dangerous one. And I think as non-believers, we have to recognize that there's a spectrum of belief. Some of it is fairly benign and fairly harmless, and the only person who's going to have trouble with it is the believer themselves, because they're hindering their own problem solving. Some of them are very outward oriented and will negatively impact other people. And I prefer to focus my secular activism on the second and third category, where the belief is actually outward focused and going to negatively impact others. So in the area of public policy and proposed violence, anytime, and even then, I like to approach that with the introduction of doubt rather than the outright statement of that's not true. Because ultimately, I might have a 99.99995% surety that there are no such things as invisible flying pigs, but there's always a chance I could be wrong. It might be a really slim chance, but there's a chance I might be wrong. So anyways, this has been, half hour goes quickly. This has been Ask a Humanist for January 2013. Thanks for joining me. I hope you found this helpful. If you did, check out my website, jen-hancock.com, and you'll find links to my Humanist Happiness course, Living Made Simple, which I teach a lot of these coping skills and how to develop these new habits that will help you be more compassionate, be more intentional, and cope with tragedy in your own life. That's really what that course is about. And actually, you can find it at humanisthappiness.com. Recommend you check it out. Thanks so much, and have a good month.